Welcome to the England Rugby Pod. Thanks for downloading episode 4. Today we take a look at the career of England and Harlequins fullback Mike Brown and see what it is he brings to the England team. You're listening to the England Rugby Pod, the rugby podcast that believes England will win the World Cup in 2019.
Good morning and welcome to today's episode. I'm Dan and I will be talking through all things Mike Brown. I have Andy here with me. He'll be offering his sort of thoughts and opinions on what I've dug up on him. Morning, Andy.
Morning, mate. Yeah, my thoughts and opinions for what they're worth.
Well, we'll find out. I know I've sort of from previous conversations you've got sort of ups and downs thoughts on Mike Brown. So it'll be interesting to sort of get your take on some of this information I've dug out. But let's get started. Right. So Michael Noel Brown, a.k.a. Mr. Angry. He was born 4th of September 1985, which makes him 31 years of age. Come the 2019 World Cup, he would be 34 should he be chosen as part of that squad. He is an athletic 183 centimetres, which is 6 foot tall, and 90 to 92 kilograms, depending on where you gain that information from. He was born in Southampton, and he attended school at Wyvern College, which is in Salisbury in Hampshire, up to the age of 15, where he then moved to Peter Symonds College, which is in Winchester in Hampshire. Actually, following Andy's sort of take from Dylan Hartley, where they did notable alumni, I did a quick research of notable alumni from a Peter Symonds College. It's probably less rugby focused, but there are certainly some big names there. There's Ben Ainsley, one of our most successful ever Olympians, is an ex-alumni. And then outside the world of sport, there was Andy Burrows, a member of Razorlight, World Champion, a member of Coldplay, the stand-up comedian Jack D, and I think probably fair to say the most talented of the lot is the glamour model Lucy Pinder. It was at this point actually I got slightly distracted for a couple of hours, but based on the fact that my research is important to me and the fact that Rach was popping over, I did a quick internet search history delete and cracked back on with all things Mike Brown.
Always wise.
Yeah, it was a smart move for sure. So when Mike Brown went to Peter Symonds College, he was initially a fly half, actually. But he was moved to fullback, I believe, fairly stubbornly from him initially, after the guidance of the coach, who is from Peter Symonds College, who's a fellow by the name of Mike Marchant. From what I understand, Mike Marchant is actually still the coach at Peter Symonds College now, but it was very much him who encouraged Mike Brown. He saw, obviously, sort of the skill set within him to make him a sort of fullback as his favoured position. And I mean, Mike Brown is quoted as absolutely crediting him with that move. Youth clubs, he had a short stint at Melksham RFC, and then he played for Salisbury. He represented Dorset and Wiltshire under 14s to under 18s, the Southwest under 18s, and Hampshire under 20s. In the summer of 2016, he married his long-term partner, who is the fashion designer Elisa Woodcock, who is actually the daughter of the former England footballer Tony Woodcock. Mike Brown is an avid Manchester United fan and states David Beckham as his sporting hero. He also says his go-to karaoke song is Wannabe by the Spice Girls. Yeah, I mean, he's, I guess, a fairly nothing sort of overly standing out in his in his background there. It seems as if he was obviously sort of a fairly talented, noticed and took a fairly sort of direct route through his rugby career.
Yeah.
Right. So looking at his club career, he is a one-club man, having joined firstly the Harlequins Academy in 2002-2003 season. For Harlequins, he has 276 appearances and 83 tries. He has over 21,000 minutes on the pitch representing Harlequins, so a fairly sizable amount.
That's a decent number of appearances and a decent number of tries and a lot of minutes.
It's a hell of a lot of minutes. It was actually in the 2007-2008 season where he was, despite not for long, but some England duty, he was also the sort of Premiership player with the most minutes on the pitch. So he is certainly a sort of regular appearer for Quins. His first senior appearance for Harlequins was in 2005 versus Doncaster Knights. This was actually obviously the season where Quins were in the equivalent of the Championship. I think it was called League One back then, but that's during that season he made his first senior appearance, and it was a week later where he made his first team start, which was versus Coventry. He had a strong impact from the outset. He was in the 2005-2006 season. He was named the club's Young Player of the Year, and the following season he was named the club's Player of the Year. Trophies for Quins, there haven't been huge amounts, but 2010-2011 season they won the Amlin Challenge Cup, beating Stade Francais in the final, of which Mike Brown was part of. And then in 2011-2012 season, obviously they won the Premiership, beating Leicester Tigers in the final, which of course Mike Brown played a big part in that season as well.
I was there for that one.
But what, were you at the game?
Yeah, 4 rows back.
I can't remember the game. Was it a good game?
To be honest, I don't remember a huge amount about it either. Both my brothers and a group of their friends were season ticket holders at Quins for a few years, and it was on one of those days when there was a ticket going spare from their group. So I went along, and we were hitting the beers pretty heavily. So I don't really remember the result, but I remember pitch invading afterwards, and it's good. Quins is quite a nice club down at the Stoop. It's all the players after the games, they have their match tees are in the main bar, but just kind of roped off. So you're all drinking, having your beers after the game, and actually they're just the other side of a rope having their dinner. So then they all come over and they chat to the fans and get quite involved. It's quite cool, and they come and have a few beers with you afterwards.
That's quite nice. I like that. I mean, I don't know, having not been to a football match for a while, but I can't imagine that's the sort of thing that happens in many other sports, to be honest. No,
I wouldn't have thought so. It's definitely one of those things about rugby, though, isn't it? It's I think, as much as footballers and various other sportsmen talk about the importance of the fans, I think it's you can just tell by the environment that you're in a rugby match, whether you're, how often have we been to rugby matches where you're pinned between opposition supporters? I mean, we had it at the World Cup against Wales, didn't we?
Yeah, sure.
And you spend the entire match abusing each other, but it's all tongue in cheek and a bit of fun, and you have a few beers afterwards and during, and everyone goes away happy-ish.
Yeah. It's. I mean, it's part of the culture, and it's part of the reason we love the sport so much, I guess. Moving on, let's have a look at Mike Brown's international career. So he has currently to date got 60 caps for England. 54 of them are as starts and 6 as substitutes. He has 10 tries within those 60 caps. 41 of them have been wins and 19 have been losses, which gives it a 68% win percentage. I had a look over that period. I couldn't ascertain, because it scoped sort of different managers, different times. I couldn't actually figure out if that win percentage is higher than England's as a whole during that period, but I imagine it probably is. But unfortunately, I wasn't able to get the definite facts for that, I'm afraid.
It's disappointing.
Yeah, sorry about that. His international career, firstly, he started as part of the England under 20. Well, I believe it was under 21s back then, but it's sort of the same setup, under 20s, under 21 team, but won the 2006 Six Nations Grand Slam. And he also later that year competed in the World Championships, representing I think it was the under 21s. The 2006-2007 season, he was capped by the England Saxons. And then in 2007, he was selected for the tour of South Africa and gained his first full cap which was actually a record 58-10 defeat to South Africa. So it's probably not how he wanted to start his international debut, but I guess it's also a baptism of fire.
And South Africa, certainly back then at least, because I think they won the World Cup, didn't they, 2007? Against us.
Against us, yes.
Beating us for the second time, I think, because weren't they in the same group as us as well?
Yeah, they beat us fairly convincingly in the group match. Obviously, the final was a lot closer, but yeah they were in our group for sure.
But yeah, South Africa back then, and when they're on form, that one thing that you can't deny them is that they're a physical side.
Yeah, they're hugely physical, and they were a top quality side back then as well. I think, especially compared to if we look at today, where they're probably experiencing a few more problems than they've had historically.
Yeah, I mean Brown, I think that probably appeals to him though, because as his namesake suggests, Mr. Angry. He enjoys the kind of the physical side of the game, doesn't he? Whether he always comes off on top or not is another question. But he certainly likes a bit of a scrap.
He's not shy of confrontation for sure. Certainly not on the pitch. I'm not sure in personal life, but yeah, I'd imagine that would sort of work to his mentality, that tour. But still, it must have been a hard first cap to lose by that much.
Yeah, I was going to say to his credit, I don't know if credit's the right word, but I'm going to use it anyway. So to his credit, I have heard that he's a very different person off the pitch to what he's like on it. So I think we're going to talk about him on the pitch, but any negativity that we might express towards him and in his position as a player doesn't necessarily convert to what he's like off the pitch. I've heard he's actually a pretty nice, pretty down to earth bloke off the field.
Yeah, and actually that's something we'll touch on in a bit. But it's interesting you say that, and I will definitely be coming back to that. But yeah, so to carry on now from the international perspective, he's actually won 7 caps as a winger, which was between November 2012 to March 2013, before he was picked as the first choice fullback for England, some of which was probably due to Ben Foden's long-term injury. But since he's got that position, he has made it his own, certainly. In 2013, in the QBE Autumn Internationals, he was named as England's Man of the Series. And then in the 2014 Six Nations, during which England finished second, Mike Brown continued his sort of outstanding international form and was named the Six Nations Player of the Championship. And interestingly, he is still the only ever England player to have won that award.
Wow. I mean, that was definitely at a time when Mike Brown was a bit of an England superstar, wasn't it? There was, I'm sure we'll talk about it more, but his position within the England camp and his kind of importance has changed, and it's like you say, despite his stats, there was that phase 13-14 when he was the first name on the team sheet, or certainly one of them, because he just made so much ground and was awesome for England.
It seemed at the time, I remember at the time, just every time he got the ball, it was always Jason Robinson-esque. You just knew he was going to be at least the first defender. And yeah, obviously his sort of role within the camp has developed or improved in some areas. Maybe it's sort of less impactful in others. But like you say, certainly during that time, he was such a key player for England. And it surprises me still that he's the only ever England player to have been a Six Nations Player of the Championship. But
yeah, especially when you think back to the quality that was there in the sort of certainly in and around the 2003 World Cup winning squad. How none of them, I mean, I suppose we did, even the Grand Slam year, which was 2003, wasn't it?
Yeah, that was 2003. And it was interesting because when I looked it up, so I believe that season, and I could be wrong, I believe that was Gordon Darty, because it didn't ring true to me that wouldn't be an England player. But I believe that year it was Gordon Darty. But there were also a couple of years that were missing. So I'm basing this, the only England player to be named it, because I heard someone else say it the other day. When I researched it and I looked up who were the players of the championship each year, he's the only England player on that list, but there were a couple of years missing. So I do apologise if my stats are wrong, but I don't think they are, because I've heard it from other sources as well.
We'll call that strike two.
I've got one more left, and no worries. Okay, so, and then, I think the last bit is obviously to say that he's obviously been an integral part of the 2016 Grand Slam and perfect year, and also of this year's Six Nations title. And also worth mentioning, certainly in the first match against Scotland, he was named as one of England's vice-captains alongside Owen Farrell and Ben Youngs.
Well, I think he is... I think he's one of Eddie Jones's vice-captains, full stop. I think that's one of the things that Eddie Jones has said quite early on, and even when there's been question marks over whether or not Brown is the best fullback, I think that the general response... I mean, we all know what Eddie Jones said about England, lacking leaders. I think he sees Brown as a key leader. And in fairness, when you look at his reaction to a number of things that have happened over his international career, but the one that springs to mind is obviously the post-2015 World Cup. I remember, when he obviously openly came out saying that he was really quite unhappy with the England squad. He'd lost a lot of trust for a lot of his teammates because of things that have been said in the press, because he's such a sort of passionate English rugby player, and representing his country is massively important to him. And you need that from a leader in a team. And I think Eddie Jones probably sees that and thinks if it's a 50-50 call, he has that over anyone else that might take that position. And that perhaps is what's keeping him in there permanently, when there are other options.
Yeah, and I agree. I mean, he's very much in the ilk, especially having sort of mentioned about, in the last one about Dylan Hartley, the captain, and his style of play. Mike Brown is very much in that same mould, the sort of the confrontational, the sort of never back down, which Eddie Jones clearly likes and respects, and is the way that he's made it clear he wants England to play.
It's interesting. It's kind of the Marmite effect, isn't it? Because Mike Brown really is a sort of love him or hate him kind of player. And as a Quins fan, I have mixed feelings about him too, because sometimes he is awesome and you're loving the fact that he's the way he is, and then other times, and it's certainly less so latterly, but that temperament becomes quite irritating at times when you kind of think, you're supposed to be a leader. You need to suck it up and get on, and it's always when it's when it's someone bigger than him, because he inevitably, fair play if you're going to start a fight, and you want to start a fight on someone bigger than you, I guess fair enough, better than going after one of the little guys.
We'll agree to disagree on that one, but
but I don't know. I think it's just the fact that It's sometimes you just say, "Come on, what are you doing?" You're watching this unfold on the pitch, and it just looks like he's the annoying kid that won't leave things alone. And actually, it's like, get back in position and crack on and take advantage of the situation. Don't let them get in your head.
There are elements definitely that I've felt about Mike Brown over the years where it can be a bit sort of toys out the pram type scenario, but I mean, It's hard to know. I guess what you've got to say is he's all or nothing. And yes, although ideally you'd want somebody to pick their fights, I guess if that's your temperament, you're not going to back down. And the first time you do it once, you compromise other times. But I definitely get what you say. And actually, as a follow-up, it was interesting you mentioned about post-2015 World Cup, because that was something I looked at, because he was very quick to come out and criticise the players who had sort of criticised sort of the build-up to the World Cup and what happened in the camp. And even I think you and I, we've played rugby sort of most of our life, and certainly nowhere near this sort of standard. But there are, even in the sort of lot lower level standard we've played, there are certain things that stay in the changing room. And you don't want people saying that. But what interestingly, actually, Mike Brown, so I read quite a lot about this, And he did use the word that it completely shot his trust of the squad. But his criticism, actually, so what he said, and I've got a few things there, that he didn't feel anyone had been good enough to make these comments. But he did say that, he said, under the cloak of anonymity. So he was saying that if they want to say that, fair enough, but be man enough to put your name to it.
Yeah, absolutely. It's interesting because I remember when this stories first came out, and my immediate reaction was I clearly either misread or misheard the quotes and things. My immediate reaction was that this guy Mike Brown was kind of saying these backhanded comments about his teammates, and that's just not on. You can't do that. It's going to come back to bite you. And actually, it was only when we decided to do this episode, and I was doing a little bit of research myself, that I realised that actually it was completely the other way around. He was the one defending that sort of, that etiquette, if you like, that changing room etiquette that, as you mentioned, is something that spans all levels of rugby.
Yeah.
You don't do that. You put on a brave face in all scenarios and all circumstances. And fair play to him, because he's absolutely right. You can't be going out and saying things about the staff. I mean, because I think a lot of it was aimed at the coaching staff.
Yeah,
I think it was saying that the training was wrong, or the game plans were wrong, and they shouldn't have done this and they shouldn't have done that, and kind of trying to put the blame on Stuart Lancaster. And I think he was basically saying, no, it doesn't work like that. We went into that game with a game plan.
Yeah.
And it doesn't. If we didn't agree with it, it needed to be brought up before, not after the fact. And you certainly, as he says, you don't go and then not privately. What's the word? What did he? A cloak of anonymity. You don't anonymously then go and start abusing, the coaching staff and your head coach.
Yeah.
Had Stuart Lancaster kept the job, and you and I both talked about this and both said that if they decided to keep him, we were okay with that. Not that it was our decision, but we kind of were behind the idea that okay, they're going to learn a lot from this and he can do a good job. And obviously we're glad with what has happened. But if he had kept his job, surely there would have had to have been players that were cut for all the wrong reasons. And it's just not a situation that you should be putting yourself in. And Brown's right; it does affect trust within the camp, because then you start questioning, what do I say, what don't I say? Because there are things that you do say that aren't for the public domain.
Yeah, and he said at the time, whether this has happened or not, I don't know, but he said there will need to be a clear the air meeting with the squad, because it had got to the point where there had been a loss in trust. And Mike Brown was quoted as saying that he's no doubt it will come out who said what, and he'll make sure he's one of the first to speak to those people. And I, for one, believe he was. Whether this has happened, I don't know.
Do we know if it did come out? Do we know who the people were? Name and shame? Or
I don't know who the people were. I did have a look, and it hasn't been said, but it wouldn't surprise me if it has come out. But this time they did keep it under, in the change room where it belonged. And yeah. I'm sure there were fairly frank discussions about what had happened and sort of code of conduct. I know. So having recently watched the story of the 2003 Rugby World Cup again, I know the England players talked about the little black book, and it wasn't, there was no attempt to try and sort of make a myth out of this or anything, but the little black book was just basically the code of conduct that all the players agreed upon. Sort of, small things like saying if a meeting was at 2:00 due to start, if you arrived, over 10 minutes early, if you were sort of 7 minutes early, you were late. You had to be there 10 minutes early. And it's small things like that successful teams need. They need that sort of agreement amongst themselves as players. And Clive Woodward was a big one to say that, no, he would let the players decide what the code of conduct was. And clearly in this instance, following the World Cup, that if there was a code of conduct, I don't know if there was, but if there was, that went out the window. And Mike Brown certainly, which I think is a testament to his character, certainly felt let down by that, by the fact that people had, gone against that and spoke out well, hadn't even spoke out. They'd given, interviews behind closed doors.
Yeah, and it's an interesting one, isn't it? Because there will be people, players as well, I'm sure, that would say, "Oh, that's just anal. It's not necessary. Why is it so important that you're 10 minutes early for a meeting and all this sort of stuff?" But you're absolutely right. You're trying to create an environment where everyone is on the same page. Yeah. So as soon as anyone has an issue with something as frankly as minor as that, and it is a minor thing, but it's important that all the minor things are kind of dealt with in the same way, because you're absolutely right. If people follow the rules, then you have far better cohesion within the squad, which is obviously so important. One that you mentioned, obviously Clive Woodward, and we're talking about 2003. One of the things that you and I have talked about on numerous occasions was the fact that Clive Woodward, and again, maybe it was the players or Martin Johnson that came up with it, and maybe it was in that little black book, but the fact that half-time, full-time, well, not full-time, but half-time, you run off the pitch, you don't walk.
Yeah.
And it's such a little thing, and you see teams doing it much more now. But I loved it. I loved the fact that they'd play a game, and at half-time, whether they were down, whether they were up, whether it was close or not, you'd see the opposition, some of them, particularly the front five, really blowing as they're walking off the pitch with their hands on their hips or on their heads trying to get a bit of oxygen, and the England players are running off.
Yeah.
It's a little psychological thing. It just says, you know what, that's only 40 minutes. We've got loads left. As they showed in the final, and I gave credit to Australia, they did it too. But it was an extra half an hour of rugby, which is a lot when you think 80 minutes is a full match. And they'd played 110 minutes, and yes, you want them to be exhausted by the end, because that shows that they've worked. They couldn't have worked any harder. But equally, you don't want them to be exhausted before the end. So better to have a little bit of excess energy than have run out of gas before the finish. And the fact that the England players agreed to do that, agreed to be fit enough to do that, and then did it, it was quite a nice little thing. That England players were always ready, pushing things along in order to kind of crack on with the next stage.
Yeah, absolutely. And Mike Brown seems very much, although not of the age, seems to be very much of that mindset. And it's something that, I think talks a lot about his character, which actually interestingly another part. And I don't want to go into too much depth here, because I think this is probably more something we can cover in depth under a sort of Chris Robshaw podcast. But looking at Tunnelgate in 2015, England versus Wales in Cardiff, when England had got wind that the lights had gone out in the stadium. It was a cold night, and England had got wind that Wales were going to wait till they were on the pitch and leave them out there for sort of 5-10 minutes in the cold, sort of in that cauldron of just Welsh attempted intimidation with no lights on, just to try and get to the England team. And the England team had obviously got wind of this, and rightly so in my mind, refused to leave the tunnel, saying, we'll go out first, but we'll go out when they're ready to go out. We're not running out there to be just left there and wait for them in their own time. Now, this was obviously Chris Robshaw leading this, but Mike Brown, and the reason I bring this up is Mike Brown was very much his lieutenant, and not just his lieutenant. I've rewatched the YouTube clips. He literally stood side by side with him and was just there straight away. So no, we're not doing it. He even at the time, which was sort of quite punchy, I guess, but one of the officials was trying to urge him, and Mike Brown tells him to relax. And then Paul James, one of the Welsh substitutes that day, and one of their props, was standing there trying to stare out the England team. And Mike Brown just looks at him and says, "You go out first if you want." So he's not scared to.
No, so you've rewatched this, yeah?
I rewatched it. I watched it on YouTube just for Tunnelgate bit, yeah.
No, well, we'll put that into the blog post on the website, because that'll be a good thing to be able to reference.
Definitely, because it's interesting. And again, I'm not going to go into background, because I think that probably deservedly so belongs more to Chris Robshaw. But it was just a sort of testament to his character. Obviously, they're very good friends. They're Quinn's teammates, they're England teammates. But Mike Brown really stood sort of front and centre with Chris Robshaw there. And
yeah, I mean, that's classic Brown, isn't it?
Yeah.
That sort of... And actually, it's more the kind of the Brown of today, where he used to kick off. He actually, to his credit, doesn't kick off as much anymore, but he still doesn't shy away from any kind of controversy. And this is a prime example. And on this occasion, he absolutely got it spot on. Sticking up for his team, his squad, and saying that we're not going to be mugged off by you lot. We're aware of your little plan. It's childish, but we can also be childish if we need to be, and we will hold our ground, and it'll give us the psychological edge because you've got this game plan that requires you to make us look silly, and it's not going to work, and suddenly you're going to not know what to do.
And as it turns out, it didn't work because we won the game, which was interesting. And actually, to go back to a point you made earlier, just sort of to cover from these points, from what I read, I hadn't actually found examples of this. So one thing that's become clear to me is Mike Brown is quite a personal guy, but I've read lots of references to people saying what a nice guy he is off the pitch. I have nothing. I've never met the guy. I don't know the guy, and I haven't got examples to prove this. But there's been enough quotes from people who are just saying like, no, he's a really good guy. So I do get the impression that the rugby Mike Brown is different to the private life Mike Brown.
Yeah, I mean, I saw an interview with him where he talks about his whole rugby career, and rugby is his life. He lives and breathes rugby. He loves it.
Yeah.
Which is great. That's what you want from certainly from an international player. That's an awesome thing. But he's obviously his nickname Mr. Angry. It's probably not a fair nickname these days, but maybe Mr. Intense would be a better nickname. Certainly there are references that I've read to the other players seeing him as this very intense member of the squad. I think he was a regular roommate with Tom Wood, who obviously is now back in the setup, but for a while he was out of it. But when they're together, they room together, and their room is always known as the intense room because the pair of them are quite similar in that respect. And that's okay. That's not a problem. That just means that you always got your head in the game. And to be fair to him, he doesn't often seem like his head isn't in the game.
Yeah.
Sometimes perhaps he has the blinkers on, and I'm sure we'll come to that because that's one of the things that I feel quite strongly about when it comes to Mike Brown. I know I'm not the only one. I've heard it in other podcasts. I've read it in lots of interviews. But he does sometimes. The blinkers go on, and he only sees one channel. But he knows what he's doing, and the one thing that you can say about Mike Brown is he very rarely, and I can't think of an example. But he very rarely loses the ball in contact when he does make his breaks. When he goes in, he may not beat the first defender like he used to, but it's very rare that he gets turned over.
Yeah, no, and I agree with that. There's also there's times of frustration where you're like, oh, just make that bloody pass sometimes. I wonder, and I was thinking this the other day, if it had been him instead of Owen Farrell during that Welsh match, when George Ford collected the ball from a kick that didn't go out past, if that had been Mike Brown, do you think he would have released Elliot Daly in the same way? I'm not sure.
I'm going to go on record and say absolutely not.
Yeah, I don't think he would.
He would have made a beeline for the corner. He'd have been tackled. We may have recycled the ball, but we probably wouldn't have ended up going over the line. Because unfortunately, one of my pet peeves, it's not a hate, but it's a peeve with Mike Brown, is that inability to pass the ball. Like, it's not an inability to pass, it's just he doesn't do it. I think he always thinks that he can do more with the ball in hand. And the key thing to a successful team, particularly a successful international team, is that ability to play as 15 men, not as individuals. And it's the success that we're seeing with England now under Eddie Jones is down to that. It's down to having the right, it's not even 15 these days, it's 23. It's having the right 23 to do the job. And if that means that, it's your wingers that score all your tries, fine. Because they only get the opportunity to do that because of the work that's done by everyone else.
Yeah.
But Mike Brown does seem to have this idea that if he's counter-attacking, the only option is to run. And I think where perhaps that was relatively new and therefore it did more damage in the past, teams are just aware of it now. It's such a thing that you just know that, probably 70%, 80% of the time, if Mike Brown's counter-attacking, he's running he's going to run the ball. So you don't worry about the overlap because he's going to hold on to it, and it's a risk worth taking. And that's a shame, because there's certainly in this last Six Nations, there were 2, maybe 3 occasions when, releasing the ball just before the tackle or as an offload would certainly have been real opportunities to score, if not guaranteed tries. But he held on and recycled the ball, sure, but that's an opportunity gone missing.
I've got a theory about this. I think this is what we're going to see for the next few years. In the 2019 World Cup final, he's going to be running. Everyone will expect him not to pass, and then he's going to release one of our wingers to score the World Cup winning try.
Is that,
I think he's playing the long game. He's playing the long con here.
That is a long game, particularly when, as you mentioned at the beginning, he'll be 34 and certainly not guaranteed a place in the 2019 squad. So fair play to him if he manages to pull this off, and this is what happens. But
I don't know if this is fact, but I think we can live by it. But it almost definitely is.
Okay.
For his thing,
because of course we're not here to talk about him, but Anthony Watson is waiting in the wings, both literally and figuratively, to take over that fullback spot potentially.
Or Elliot Daly, perhaps.
Well, yeah, but what I just mean, Watson is playing fullback for Bath week in, week out.
Yeah.
He plays on the wing for England, but most of his rugby is played at the back. And when you have Jack Noel and Elliot Daly and Johnny May and various others who are not involved or rarely involved, but by no means lesser players waiting to have their chance. It kind of always feels like wing is one of those positions where you can try a few more things. You want a specialist fullback, and Mike Brown has been that for a long time. But we know that Watson is a specialist fullback because he does it week in, week out for Bath.
Yeah.
So it'll be interesting to see whether Watson stays on the wing, which where he's not practicing, and it is a different position. It requires different skills. So it will be interesting to see whether Eddie says, actually, yes, he's there now to get his international experience, but long term, I'm looking at him for the 15 shirt.
Yeah, potentially, and I mean that will be interesting because as sort of young fullbacks go, it probably is a long moment for Watson's. There's at the moment I can't think of any who are putting their hands up as the definite next England fullback. But then Mike Brown, he's in the team on merit at the moment. I think that's for sure. And if that continues up to 2019, 34, then good for him. If not, I'm sure there'll be plenty of other options. With regards to Mike Brown, there were some other bits that sort of Red found out, which was probably more focused on his sort of personal life, and there's certainly been some tough times there. But we're not Hello magazine, so I didn't really want to. I wanted to keep this more rugby focused. So I must admit I've left them out because I don't know how much value it adds to him as a profile and him as a rugby player.
We now have a whole load of listeners going, why have you told us that if you're not going to tell us what it was?
Well, guys, Google it and I'm sure you can find out. But I don't want to start dealing in all this gossip about sort of what was said, what has happened in his personal life. As like I said, I'm not sure how much value it adds to his rugby profile.
Fair enough.
Great. Anything else from you, mate?
No, I don't think so. I think, we've had a bit of a chat about him. I'm sure there's plenty more to talk about. But as you say, not to do the guy a disservice, but he's probably not one of the most interesting players in terms of discussing him on a podcast.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think with Mike Brown, he tends to be a fairly sort of down the line type fella who sort of what you see is what you get. Great. Well, yeah, it's been good talking to you about Mike Brown. Everyone, thanks very much for listening. We appreciate it, and we will be back soon. I believe our next one will be a follow-up to the Lions podcast, which we'll certainly put the details on the website about when that will be coming up. So we'll be dealing with that soon. And obviously for our next player profile, Andy will be hosting, and I'm interested and waiting to hear on exactly who that will be. So for now, thanks very much and goodbye.
Cheers, guys. Take care.